The morning she dragged that freight wagon into the draw, it was a Tuesday in early November of 1987, and the sky had gone the color of old tin about an hour before first light. I remember that detail because I was standing at the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, watching the fog settle along the low ground by the creek, and I saw her truck come down the county road with something large and dark swaying on the flatbed behind it, the chain binders catching what little light there was. It was cold enough that the mud had a skin of ice on it by 6 in the morning, but not cold enough to hold a truck's weight across the low crossing. So she came down the long way, through the draw, and the thing behind her came with her, half tilted and groaning on the chains. I didn't know what it was yet. I put on my coat and went out to the fence to look. My name is not important to this story, but my proximity to it is. I ran the ground to the east of her operation for 31 years by that point, and I had watched her work that quarter section since she came back to it in the spring of 1974, after her mother passed and left her the land and the debt that came with it. She was 32 years old that November morning in 1987, and she had been working that ground alone for 13 years by then. Alone is the right word. She had a hired man come for planting and again for harvest, but the rest of it she did herself, and she did it in the way her grandfather had laid out, which was a way that a lot of people in that county had stopped believing in by the time she inherited it. What she was dragging into the draw that November morning was the remains of a freight wagon, not a farm wagon, a freight wagon, the heavy kind, with a box nearly 14 feet long and iron hardware that had been meant to hold up to road weight and loaded miles. Someone had stripped the running gear off it at some point, or it had rotted off, I couldn't tell which from the fence line, and what was left was the box itself, the floor planks and the sideboards and the front and rear standards, all of it darkened with age and sitting on 2 good rear wheels and a set of temporary skids she had bolted to the front where the axle had gone. It was lopsided and heavy, and making a sound that suggested it did not enjoy being moved. She had paid $40 for it at an estate auction in September, and I know that figure because by the following noon the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown, but the $40 stayed consistent, because that's the kind of number that travels accurately. People remember what something cost when they think the price was wrong. I will tell you what I knew about her reasons that morning, and then I will tell you what I learned later, because those are 2 different things, and they ought to be kept separate. What I knew that morning was that she had been overwintering livestock in a 2-bay equipment shed that leaked at the northwest corner and had a concrete apron that heaved every hard freeze and cracked in ways that made drainage go where you did not want it to go. It was not a good winter shelter. It was what she had, and she had been making it work. But making it work was costing her in bedding and in the slow, grinding kind of livestock loss that you don't always see coming until you're already into it. She was running 23 head of mixed breeding stock that fall, and 23 head in a leaking equipment shed through a hard Midwest winter is a problem you solve or you pay for, and sometimes you pay for it in ways that don't come back. The county extension agent had been out to see her in October. Young man, clean Carhartt jacket, clipboard in the crook of his arm like he'd been issued it along with the jacket. He walked the equipment shed, and he walked the lot, and he wrote down what he saw, and then he told her that a new livestock housing structure of appropriate dimension for 23 head, built to current recommended standards, would run her somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000, depending on materials and whether she poured new concrete or worked with what she had. He said it with the gentle, regretful confidence of a man delivering a number he expects to end the conversation, which is a particular kind of confidence I have never trusted. She thanked him and walked him back to his truck, and I know how that went because she told me about it afterward, standing at the same fence where I had watched her come in with the wagon, and she said, quiet and without particular heat, that he was probably right about the number and probably wrong about the conclusion. I asked her what she meant. She said she wasn't ready to say yet. That was October. Then it was the Tuesday in November, with the tin-colored sky and the lopsided freight wagon coming down into the draw. And I was at the fence again, and she stopped the truck and got out and walked back to check the rear binder, and I called over to her and asked her what she was doing. She looked up at me with the expression she used when a question had an answer she considered obvious. I told her I was farming, she said, and got back in the truck. By noon, the diner had that version too, and the version had grown, but the I told her I was farming stayed consistent, because that's also the kind of thing that travels accurately. Now, I want to be honest about my reasons for telling this story the way I am telling it, which is slowly and from the outside moving inward, because that is how I came to understand it, and I think the pace of the understanding matters to what the understanding is worth. A person can tell you the conclusion, and it will mean one thing. A person can walk you to the conclusion the way she walked me to it, which took the better part of 4 months, and it will mean something else entirely. Her grandfather used to say that a thing given is worth what it cost the giver, and a thing earned is worth what it cost the earner. And the difference between those two things is the difference between knowing and understanding. He said that about soil preparation, but it applied to everything he ever touched. I heard him say it once when I was 11 years old, standing in his equipment barn while he sharpened a disc blade. And I have never forgotten it, and I did not know until many years later that he had also written it down. He had written a great many things down. That is the part of the story I did not know that Tuesday morning, watching her back the freight wagon off the flatbed on the low ground of the draw. I did not know about the notebook yet. She had not told me about it, and I had not asked, and even if I had asked, she might not have been ready to tell me, because she was still working out what it meant herself, and that is the kind of working out that a person has to do in private before they can explain it to anyone else. But the notebook was part of why she was doing what she was doing, and the freight wagon was part of the notebook. And both of those things require more ground laying before they make the sense they are supposed to make, so I will lay the ground. Her grandfather had come to that quarter section in 1931, which was a hard year to come to any ground in that part of the country, and he had worked it for 44 years before his heart quit on him in the summer of 1975. He was 81 years old when he died, which means he was 37 when he started, which is not a young man's beginning, but not an old one's either. He was a precise, methodical person who believed that observation was a form of work, and that the failure to record what you observed was a form of waste. He kept a notebook for every year he worked that ground, starting in 1931 and running through 1974, which was the last full season he managed before his health made him step back from the heavy work. 44 notebooks. They were marbled composition books, the kind with the black and white cover that drugstores used to carry, and he kept them in a wooden crate in the back of the equipment barn, and the crate had his initials burned into the lid, and his granddaughter knew the crate was there because she had watched him add to it every winter since she was old enough to follow him into the barn. But she had not read them, not systematically, not the way they needed to be read, until the winter of 1985, 2 years before the morning I am describing. She read them in order, starting with 1931, one notebook at a time, at the kitchen table after supper, over the course of 2 winters. She told me later that reading them straight through, in sequence, was different from dipping into them, which she had done occasionally over the years. Read straight through, they were not a collection of notes. They were an argument. A single, patient, 44-year argument about how that particular ground wanted to be worked, and what it would give you if you worked it the way it wanted, and what it would withhold if you didn't. He had been wrong about things. He said so plainly in the notebooks, and he said what he had been wrong about, and what the wrongness had cost him, and what he had done to come back from it. He was not sentimental about himself. That was one of the things she said about the notebooks that I remember most clearly. He was not sentimental about himself, but he was reverent about the ground, and those are two different things, and knowing the difference was what made the notebooks worth reading. There were two entries she kept coming back to. The first was from 1938, and it was a short entry, not more than 3 lines, and it said the following, which she showed me later. Broke the second cut Timothy on the south draw flat. Ground under there is not what I expected, not what I was told. Worth a second look when there is time to give it. There was no second entry on that question in 1938. There was no entry on it in 1939 or 1940 or 1941. The years moved through the notebook, and the war came and went, and the ground kept being worked, and the notes kept being taken, methodical and precise. Rows of numbers in pencil that had gone brown with age, yield figures and input costs and weather observations, and the small defeats and recoveries that make up a working farm's real history. Then, in 1949, in the fall notebook, there was a second entry about the South Draw Flat, and it said only this. Never did go back. Should have. Don't know what's under there. He had circled those last 5 words. Don't know what's under there. Circled them in pencil, which suggested he had come back to the passage after writing it, looked at it, and decided those 5 words were the ones that mattered. She told me she sat with those 2 entries for the better part of a winter evening before she moved on. She said she put the 1949 notebook down and looked out the kitchen window at the dark and thought about her grandfather circling those words at some point, some November or December, when the ground was frozen and the work was slow, and there was time to sit with a notebook and reckon with the things you had meant to do and hadn't. She said she understood then that the circle was not a regret. It was an instruction. He was leaving it for whoever came after, in the way that careful people leave things for whoever comes after, without announcement and without guarantee that anyone will find it, but with the faith that if the right person finds it, they will know what to do with it. She was the right person. I want to say something about the South Draw Flat before I go further, because the geography matters. The draw itself runs roughly northeast to southwest across the lower quarter of her section, and the flat at the bottom of it is a low, sheltered piece of ground, maybe 4 acres at full extent, that sits below the surrounding field grade by somewhere between 3 and 6 feet, depending on where you're standing. The sides of the draw come down at a gentle enough angle that you can work them with equipment if you're careful, but the flat at the bottom is its own thing, protected from the prevailing wind by the slopes on both sides, and it holds warmth in the early and late season in a way that the upland ground doesn't. Her grandfather had run timothy on it, and some years oats, and one year a late-season sorghum that he noted did better than it had any right to do given the date he put it in. The ground there was darker than the upland ground, blacker really, the kind of black that means something about what has accumulated there over a long time. He noted that too in 1931, in his first year, and then he noted it again in 1938, when he broke the second cut timothy and found the subsoil different from what he had been told to expect. She walked that flat in the fall of 1985, after she finished the notebooks, with a tile probe and a notebook of her own, making notes the way he had taught her to make notes, which was to write what you actually saw rather than what you expected to see. She probed every 12 feet on a grid she had stepped out and staked with wire flags, 41 probe points across the 4 acres, and she pulled a soil sample at every flag and set the samples in labeled jars on the tailgate of her truck and looked at them in the thin November light. The subsoil samples from the center of the flat were different from the samples at the margins, darker, finer textured, with a smell that she described to me later as the smell of something that had been sitting still for a very long time and was ready to stop sitting still. She took 9 of the center samples to the Extension Office for testing in January of 1986, not to the young agent with the clipboard, but to the older woman in the soil laboratory who had been running tests in that county since 1962 and who had seen enough samples to know what she was looking at before the numbers came back. The older woman had looked at the jars for a long moment, turning them in her hands, and then she had set them down on the bench and said one word: exceptional. Then she had gone quiet for a moment longer and said, "I'd like to see the rest of the profile before I tell you what I think. But if the rest of it comes back the way these suggest, you are looking at something substantial under that flat." She said it the way people say true things, which is without decoration, and she went back to her work, and that was the extent of the conversation. But exceptional was enough. Exceptional, said that way by a woman who had been reading soil samples for 24 years, was more than enough. The numbers came back in March of 1986. The organic matter percentage in the center of that flat was running at levels that the upland ground around it hadn't seen in 40 years of continuous cropping. The cation exchange capacity was higher than anything in the surrounding field. The water-holding capacity numbers were the kind that make agronomists write things down without being asked. She sat with those numbers for a year, and I mean that literally. She sat with them for a full year before she decided what to do, because she was her grandfather's granddaughter, and she did not move until she understood what she was moving toward. What she understood by the fall of 1987 was that the South Draw Flat was not a field. It never had been, not really. It was a different kind of resource, and the question was, what kind of use deserved it? She had been thinking about the overwintering problem with her breeding stock at the same time she was thinking about the draw flat. And at some point in the late summer of 1987, those two problems came together in a way that suggested they were not two problems, but one solution. If the flat could be managed carefully, its soil health protected and deepened rather than mined. And if it could also shelter livestock through the worst of the winter in a way that returned organic matter to the ground in a controlled and distributed way, then the flat would improve itself over time rather than decline. And the livestock would have winter ground that the wind couldn't find, and the whole system would move in the same direction, her grandfather's direction. That was what she said. I told her she'd found a way to let the ground pay for its own care, and she nodded and said yes, and that her grandfather had been trying to say that about that specific piece of ground since 1938, and that it had taken her the better part of 50 years, counting from when he first wrote it down, to hear him. She needed shelter in the draw flat, not a building which she couldn't afford and which would require a concrete permit and a setback variance and several months of conversations with county offices she did not have time for. She needed something that would cut the wind and hold heat and give her stock a place to come to out of the wet and the cold, something that could go into the draw without heavy equipment and without a foundation and without the $9,000 conversation the extension agent had offered her. She had been thinking about this for several months when she saw the freight wagon at the estate auction in September, and she had walked around it twice. And then she had bid $40 on it, and she had gone home and looked at her grandfather's notebooks for an hour, and then she had gone to sleep. The freight wagon box, once she had it in the draw, and had cut a series of vent gaps in the upper boards, and laid new poplar plank on the floor where the old planks had gone soft, and had hung a heavy canvas at the open end on the north side and left the south end accessible, was 14 feet long by nearly 5 feet wide by 4 feet in the clear under the top rails. It was not warm the way a barn is warm, but it was dry, and it was out of the wind, which on the floor of the draw was a different quality of shelter than you might expect. The draw itself blocked the northwest wind that came with the hard, cold snaps, and the wagon's remaining boards, 2 inches of old-growth oak, dense and close-ringed, held whatever heat the animals made. She bedded it with 8 inches of wheat straw, and she put a loose mineral block inside, and she left the animals to decide about it themselves, which is always the right decision, and which the old books will tell you if you read them. The animals decided about it inside of 3 days. They decided in favor of it, which she had expected, because animals understand shelter in a way that precedes any human instruction, and because the floor of the draw was already warmer than the surrounding ground by 4 or 5 degrees on a clear night. a fact she had been tracking with a maximum thermometer at 3 points in the draw since October of 1986. By the first week of December, she had all 23 head using the wagon and the area immediately around it for their primary overnight shelter, and she had closed the leaking equipment shed except for equipment, which was what it had been designed for in the first place. She spent $40 on the wagon, and she spent $61 on hardware and new poplar plank and hinges and the canvas for the wind end, and she spent one November Saturday doing the work, and she lost 0 head that winter, not one. The previous 2 winters she had lost 3 animals total to weather-related illness, and those losses, at the prices she was getting for breeding stock at that time, had cost her more than the extension agent's $9,000 building would have cost her if she had spread the payment over 4 years. She did not tell me the exact numbers that winter. She told me in the spring at the fence again, in April of 1988, when the ground was starting to open up and the animals were back on the draw flat and beginning to work it the way she had intended, and she said the numbers quietly and without ceremony, the way she said everything, and then she said one more thing that I have thought about many times since. She said that the wagon had paid for itself before Christmas. She said that was not the part that mattered most. I asked her what was. She looked out at the draw flat and at the animals moving across the black ground in the early spring light, and she said that the part that mattered most was that her grandfather had known it was there. He had known in 1938 that there was something under that flat worth attending to, and he had not had the time or the means to attend to it the way it deserved, and he had written it down so that whoever came after him would have the chance he hadn't. She said that sitting in the kitchen reading those notebooks on winter evenings, she had felt, not for the first time, but more strongly than before, that the ground on that quarter section had been in a conversation with her family for a very long time, and that her job was to hold up her end of the conversation, and that the wagon and the draw flat and the winter the animals had just come through were all part of holding up her end. I didn't have anything to say to that. I stood at the fence for a while and watched the animals on the flat, and then I went back to my own work. The story does not end in the spring of 1988, though that is where I first understood it. The draw flat, managed the way she managed it, with the animals working it in rotation and the organic matter building year over year, came up in a soil test 6 years later to numbers that the woman at the extension laboratory called, when she saw the report, the best she had seen on any parcel in that county in her 32 years of testing. The older woman had retired by then, but she came in one afternoon to look at the numbers when she heard about them, and she stood at the counter and read the report for a long time, and then she said only that she was not surprised, which was high praise from her, and everyone present understood it as such. The freight wagon stayed in the draw until 1994, when the floor finally gave out past the point of repair, and she replaced it not with a building, but with a second wagon, a farm wagon that time, bought at auction for $65 and modified in the same manner, and it served for another 8 winters. By the time that second wagon came out, the draw flat had become the most productive 4 acres on the section, producing hay yields in the low cuttings that ran 30% above the county average in good years, and doing it without the input costs that the county average required, because the ground had been fed from the inside for 15 years by then, the way ground is supposed to be fed, which is slowly and from below and with patience. I asked her once in the mid-1990s whether she had ever considered taking the extension agent's advice and building the $9,000 structure. She thought about it for a moment, and then she said that she had considered it the way you consider a path you can see isn't going where you need to go. She said the agent was a good man and had given her accurate numbers, and she did not fault him for any of it. She said the number had simply been the answer to a different question than the one she was actually asking. The question she was asking was not how much does it cost to house 23 head for a winter. The question she was asking was, what does this ground need from me, and what do I need from this ground, And is there a way to answer both questions with the same action? She said her grandfather had taught her to look for that kind of answer, the kind where the ground and the operation move in the same direction at the same time, and that when you found one, it was usually cheaper than the alternatives because it was working with what was already there rather than against it. I want to tell you about the morning I finally read the notebooks myself, because she let me borrow the crate in the winter of 1996, after we had been talking across that fence for nearly 10 years about what was in them, and I took the crate home and read all 44 notebooks at my kitchen table over the course of 6 weeks, and the experience was what she had said it would be, which was less like reading notes and more like being argued with by a very patient man who had been dead for 21 years and was confident that he had time on his side. He had been right about nearly everything he had argued about. Not everything. He had been wrong about tile drainage on the northwest corner of his section in a way that took him 7 years to correct, and he said so plainly in the 1944 notebook and described the correction in the same plain terms. He had been wrong about a crop rotation decision in 1953 and had said so in the same year rather than waiting, which I found admirable in a way I did not expect to find admirable in a dead man's notebook. But the thing that stayed with me, the thing I kept coming back to after I returned the crate to her barn and went back to my own work, was the entry from 1949, the one with the circled words. Don't know what's under there. I sat with those words for a long time, the way she had sat with them in her kitchen in the winter of 1985. I sat with them because they seemed to me to be about more than soil. A man who had been working a piece of ground for 18 years, who had been recording everything he observed with the patience and precision of a person who believed that observation was a form of work, writing down in the fall of his 49th year that there was something under a particular flat that he had not gotten back to, that he should have gotten back to, that he did not understand, and then circling it, not as a regret, as an instruction. The field doesn't care who believes in it. That is the thing I took from the notebooks, not a sentence her grandfather ever wrote in those exact words, but the thing every sentence added up to across all 44 years of them. He had put his faith in a particular piece of ground, and in the patient, attentive methods that ground had taught him, and he had passed that faith along in the only way available to him, which was to write it down carefully and put it in a wooden crate with his initials on the lid, and leave it for whoever came after. She had come after, and she had read it the way it needed to be read, which is slowly, in order, over 2 winters, until the argument became clear, and the instruction in the circled words became clear, and the 4 acres in the draw flat, and the freight wagon, and the 23 head of breeding stock, and the winter. They all came through together, began to feel like a single answer to a question a careful man had asked and left open 49 years before she was ready to close it. I stood at the fence on a morning in April of 1988 and watched her walk the draw flat in the early light, stepping through the black ground that her animals had been working all winter, bending occasionally to press her fingers into it. And I thought about what it cost to know something over a long time versus what it costs to be told something quickly, and about which of those 2 kinds of knowledge actually stays with you when the hard winters come. The extension agent's $9,000 number was not wrong, but it was not earned in the way that $40 and a Tuesday in November and a circled sentence in a dead man's notebook and 2 winters of reading and a floor of old-growth oak in a draw that cut the northwest wind were earned. The earned thing was the one that carried her. Her grandfather used to write in the early notebooks a phrase he came back to in different forms across the years, and the form I remember best is from the 1936 notebook. The difference between a thing that lasts and a thing that spends is whether the ground is moving with you or waiting for you to finish. I do not know if he knew how precisely that applied to the South Draw Flat. I think he suspected. I think the circled words in 1949 were him suspecting as clearly as he could and writing it down so the suspicion would outlast him. It did. It outlasted him by 49 years, and it came to rest in his granddaughter's hands on winter evenings at a kitchen table. And from there it went into the ground the way good things go into good ground, slowly and with patience. And it came back up as something that fed and sheltered and carried forward the work of a family on a piece of land that had been trying to tell them something since 1938. The neighbor to my west stopped at my fence in the fall of 1988, about a year after the wagon went in, and he asked me what she was doing with a broken freight wagon on the low ground of the draw. I told him she was farming. He looked at the draw for a moment, at the wagon and the animals around it, and then he said, "Well, it's not as wet down there as it used to be," and drove on. That was the extent of his concession. It was enough. It was the kind of thing that travels accurately. If you have walked a piece of ground that your grandfather walked before you and found something he left in it for you, or if you have read a notebook by a single barn bulb and heard a dead man give you the answer to a question you had been carrying for years, I would like to hear about it. Put it in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we get there, and there is more ground to cover.